Her first night in the wide, merciless frontier. The silence of the plains pressed heavy around her, broken only by the sigh of the wind. And then a whisper, frail and trembling, escaped Clara Whitfield's lips. "You're too big, it won't fit." The words hung in the darkness, fragile as glass, and even she did not know if they carried more fear or wonder. What kind of man could seem so immense, so formidable, that his presence alone made her tremble? And how could a mail-order bride, delicate, uncertain, untested, ever hope to survive in a world so vast and unyielding? If you were Clara, standing at the threshold of a life far greater than you had ever dreamed, would you stay? Or would you flee into the night? Tell us your thoughts in the comments. And if tales of courage, passion, and survival against impossible odds stir something inside you, don't forget to subscribe for more Frontier Tales. But Clara's journey to the Wild West, and to the rancher known only as Jonah Blackthorne, had begun long before she ever whispered those fearful words. He wind, an endless, restless voice that never ceased its wandering across the high plains of the Wyoming Territory. It carried the sharp bite of dust, the dry tang of sagebrush, and the memories of ages past. For 41 years, Jonah Blackthorne had listened to that wind. Every gust had carved itself into him, shaping a man as unyielding as the earth beneath his boots. The land had hardened him, scarred him, made him into something as enduring and vast as the mesas on the horizon. The neighbors, few and scattered across the territory, spoke his name with equal measures of awe and caution. They whispered of his strength, his silence, his shadow that seemed to stretch further than most men dared to tread. Some called him a giant. Others said he was cursed to walk the earth alone. And yet, even giants grow weary of their own echoes. Jonah's days were marked by labor. He had split the timber that framed his barns, set the posts that lined his miles of fencing, and driven herds across plains until the thunder of hooves was stitched into his bones. His hands bore calluses like armor. His shoulders carried the weight of both the land and the loneliness that clung to it. When the sun dipped low, casting the plains in crimson shadow, and the coyotes lifted their howls to the darkening sky, the ranch would fall silent. Too silent. It was then, in the long hours between dusk and dawn, that Jonah Blackthorne felt the true cost of his solitude pressing hardest against his chest. It was that silence, more than anything else, that finally drove him to write. The letter was simple, plain, almost clumsy in its honesty. No poetic flirtatious, no grand promises, just a plea scratched in rough handwriting, carried eastward by train. Come west, be my wife, share this life with me. In Kansas City, far from the desolate sweep of the Wyoming plains, a young woman bent over that letter with careful hands. Clara Whitfield had never known ease. The city was crowded, harsh, and unkind to women without family or fortune. Her life had been measured in endless chores, in work that paid too little, in dreams that withered faster than flowers in a drought. But in Jonah's letter, in that rough scrawl, she glimpsed something she had been denied all her years: steadiness, safety, perhaps even belonging. And so, the decision came swiftly. One trunk packed with meager belongings. One ticket clutched tight in her hand. One leap of faith that would carry her beyond all she had ever known. The journey west was long. Rail cars rattled through endless miles of track, clattering through landscapes that shifted from green fields to barren plains to mountains that clawed at the sky. At each stop, Clara's resolve was tested by the stares of strangers, by the doubts whispered in her own heart. Yet every mile carried her closer to him, to the man whose legend, whispered in the territories, loomed larger than truth. By the time she stepped down from the stagecoach, her dress powdered in dust and her hands trembling around the handle of her trunk, Clara's heart was a storm. Fear, hope, and a courage she had not known she possessed. And then she saw him, Jonah Blackthorn, a man cut from the earth itself, broad as the barn beams he had raised with his own hands, towering like the cottonwoods that lined the riverbanks. His face was carved in lines of weather and hardship, his eyes the color of a storm rolling in from mountains. Her heart stuttered in her chest. For the first time, Clara understood the warnings whispered by the other women in the boarding house, the ones who shook their heads when they learned of her choice. This was no ordinary rancher. This was a man built on a scale that defied reason, a man who seemed as immense and unyielding as the land itself. And now, he was her husband. The storm of Clara Whitfield's arrival had not been the kind carried by clouds or thunder. It was the storm of two lives colliding. A girl raised in soft silence, brought westward by promises scribbled in ink, and a man carved by wilderness, his voice weathered like the timber beams of his home. Jonah Blackthorn stood like an immovable figure on the edge of his porch. Behind him stretched acres of barren hills, a world far too large for any one soul to tame. And yet, he had done it, piece by piece, year by year. The land bent to his will, though it never broke. Clara, trembling still, felt the truth of the whispers she had spoken that night. "You're too big. It won't fit." Her words had not been about his body alone, though that had sparked the fear. It was his life, his presence, his world. And she was a single bird flung into it, wings untested, unsure she could fly in skies this wide. The train that had carried her west was long gone. No whistle echoed in the night to offer retreat. Only Jonah remained, his shadow long against the flickering lantern light. Inside, Jonah said at last. His voice was gravel and earth. "You'll catch your death out here." Inside, the word cut through her like a command. And yet, she obeyed. The cabin swallowed her in darkness and wood smoke. It was not a home as she had imagined from magazines in Boston. There were no velvet curtains, no embroidered cushions. Here, life was plain. A heavy oak table scarred by years of use. A bed too large, its frame iron, its sheets coarse but clean. A fire smoldered low in the stone hearth, glowing like an old heart refusing to go out. Jonah shut the door behind her. The silence that followed was not empty. It was alive. The sound of the wind clawing at the shutters. The faint groan of timber beams under strain. Her own heartbeat, quick, uneven. He moved past her, his sighs filling the small space until the walls themselves seemed to shrink. Without a word, he poured water from a jug into a tin cup and set it before her. "Drink!" Clara's hands shook as she lifted it. The water was cold, biting, but it steadied her. Jonah sat across the table, his elbows resting heavy on the wood. He studied her in silence, not with hunger, not with cruelty, but with something harder to define. A man who had learned patience the way one learns to breathe. She was an intruder in his solitude, yet she was also chosen. "You expected someone else," Jonah said finally. His voice was low, deliberate. Clara swallowed, throat dry despite the water. I thought perhaps," she stopped. The words felt foolish. What had she expected? A gentleman in polished boots, tipping his hat? A smile rehearsed in mirrors back east? Not this. Not a man whose shoulders seemed to carry the sky. Jonah leaned back, the chair creaking beneath him. His eyes were sharp, storm gray, and unflinching. "I told the agency what I was, what I had. If they didn't tell you true, that ain't on me." Clara set the cup down, her hand lingering on the rim. "I read your letter. It was few words, hard words." He almost smiled, though it never reached his mouth. "I'm not one for dressing things up." Silence stretched between them again, thick as the plains night. Clara fought to keep her breath even. This was her husband. By law, by contract, by promise. A stranger bound to her, and she to him. And he was too big. His world was too vast. His life too heavy. Could she ever fill even a corner of it? That first night was not filled with passion. It was filled with distance. Jonah slept on the far side of the bed, his back to her, his breath steady as the land itself. Clara lay awake, staring into the shadows that loomed on the ceiling. The silence pressed against her like another body. Every creak of the house, every sigh of the wind, was a reminder that she was not home. She was adrift, a bird in a cage too wide, too strange. But dawn came, and with it, the sound of Jonah moving through his morning as if she were not there. Boots pulled on, rifle checked, door unlatched. The day called to him, and he answered it with the same wordless resolve that had built his life. Clara followed, uncertain. The air outside was sharp, laced with dust and cold sunlight. The land stretched endlessly, hills rolling like the backs of sleeping beasts. Fences stood in jagged lines, weather-beaten but sturdy. Cattle dotted the distance, their cries raw against the wind. "This is it," Jonah said, his voice carrying over the morning hush. "My life, my land, yours now too." Clara's breath caught. It was beautiful and terrifying. No city street had ever seemed so vast, no ballroom so endless. Jonah glanced at her, reading her silence. "You'll learn it, or it'll break you." She met his gaze, surprised at the bluntness. He didn't say it to be cruel. He said it as truth, and perhaps that was worse. The days that followed were not gentle. Jonah worked from dawn to dusk, every motion purposeful, every step heavy with the weight of survival. Clara stumbled, faltered, but followed where she could. Her hands, once pale and delicate, blistered against rough rope and splintered wood. Her skirts tore. Her shoes wore thin. But each evening, when she sank onto the edge of that iron-framed bed, she was still there, still fighting, still trying. Jonah noticed. He did not praise her. Words of praise were foreign on his tongue. But he noticed when she lifted more than he thought she could, when she stood her ground against a stubborn mule, when she did not cry at the crack of a whip or the bellow of a storm. And slowly, without either of them saying it, a space began to form. Not love, not yet, but something rawer, respect. Evenings stretched longer. The fire burned brighter. Clara found her voice, asking him about the land, the seasons, the years he had spent alone. Jonah answered in pieces, never more than he wished, but always honest. She learned he had come west as a boy, his parents swallowed by sickness before the first frost. He had raised himself from nothing. Every stone, every fence post, every acre was carved by his own hands. Clara listened wide-eyed. Her own life, a string of needlepoint lessons and quiet parlor visits, seemed like a dream compared to his. And yet, here they sat, bound by law, by chance, by words she had spoken in fear, but now carried new meaning. "You're too big," she whispered one night when the silence grew soft. Jonah turned to her, brow furrowed. She smiled faintly, though her voice trembled. "I wasn't only speaking of your size. I meant all of this. You, the land. It feels too much for me." Jonah's gaze held hers, steady, unflinching. "You'll grow into it." The words were not tender, but they were the closest he had come to promise. The Montana sky had a way of swallowing sound. At dawn, the land was a canvas of muted golds and silvers, the horizon a line drawn too far for eyes to reach. Clara often stood on the porch in those early hours, her shawl clutched tight around her shoulders, watching as Jonah mounted his horse and rode into the hills. He didn't ask her to follow. He didn't ask her to stay, either. Jonah Blackthorne simply lived and expected the world, her included, to keep pace. Clara watched him disappear into the distance, the figure of him swallowed by the endless expanse, and wondered how any man could be so large. Not just in form, though his frame seemed cut for mountains, but in spirit, in presence. He belonged here in a way she doubted she ever could. "You're too big," she whispered again, her words stolen by the wind. That morning she turned to the cabin with determination she had not felt the night before. If she could not ride with him, then she would make herself useful here. The home spoke of neglect, not of dirt or disrepair, but of a man who did not notice the little things. Curtains left threadbare, shelves bare save for tools and spare ammunition. A hearth too cold, though it was piled high. She rolled up her sleeves, ignoring the sting in her palms from yesterday's rope burns. Scrubbing, mending, coaxing warmth back into the corners of the house. These were skills she knew. Boston had taught her the art of refinement, of gentility. But here, refinement was not embroidery on linen. It was survival dressed as comfort. By the time Jonah returned at dusk, the cabin smelled faintly of bread. The table was cleared, a cloth spread neatly across it. A lantern glowed, not only in the corner but on the table itself, softening the lines of the room. Jonah entered without a word, stamping the dust from his boots. His eyes fell on the bread cooling by the hearth, then on Clara herself, cheeks flushed from effort, hair falling loose from its pins. For a moment brief, fleeting, his gaze softened. "You've been busy," he said. Clara set her chin. Didn't seem right the way it was. Jonah grunted, moving past her. But as he sat, breaking bread in his calloused hands, she caught it. The smallest flicker at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but close enough to make her chest tighten. The nights grew less silent after that. Jonah still spoke sparingly, but Clara learned to read the pauses between his words. When he shifted in his chair, when his gaze lingered on the flames, when his hand rested heavy on the table, as if grounding himself. And sometimes, when the wind howled outside, Clara found herself speaking just to fill the quiet. Stories of Boston, of dresses and dances, of music that seemed so distant now, it felt like another life. Jonah listened, not with rapt attention, but with the patience of a man accustomed to the endless telling of the wind. He did not mock her for her past, nor pity her. He simply listened. It was enough. But the West was not gentle nor forgiving. Clara discovered this one morning when Jonah led her out past the far fences. The cattle were restless, their cries sharp against the cold air. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, though the season promised no rain. "Lightning struck out here last week," Jonah explained, his tone flat as ever. "Fire caught near the ridge. I stamped it out, but they're spooked, haven't grazed proper since." Clara glanced at the animals, their eyes wide and rolling, their bodies shifting like a restless sea. "They look frightened," she whispered. Jonah nodded once. Fear spreads quick in a herd, quicker than truth. Takes only one to start a stampede. The words sank into her, not just about cattle, about people, about her. She clenched her fists, determined not to be the frightened one. Jonah mounted his horse, motioning for her to stand aside as he rode into the field. But Clara stayed where she was, skirts whipping against her legs in the wind. If fear was contagious, so too was resolve. She would not give in. Not here. Not now. Jonah noticed. His eyes, sharp as stormlight, lingered on her longer than usual. And though he said nothing, she felt it. His respect growing, slow and steady, like roots beneath the earth. That night, Clara could not sleep. The storm pressed against the windows, rattling the shutters, clawing like some wild beast. Jonah slept soundly beside her, his breath deep, untroubled. She envied it. But then, thunder cracked. The cattle cried out, a frantic chorus beyond the walls. Jonah was out of bed in an instant, boots half pulled on, rifle in hand. "Stay inside," he ordered. But Clara was already at the door, shawl thrown around her shoulders. "Jonah!" He turned, eyes flashing like the storm outside. "This ain't for you, Clara. Stay." And for the first time, she defied him. "No. If I'm to be your wife, if I'm to live here, I won't cower every time the world shows its teeth." For a moment, silence. Only the thunder filling the gap. Then Jonah nodded once, curt, and turned back into the storm. Clara followed. The night became chaos. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the sea of cattle crashing against one another, their fear thick as smoke. Jonah's voice cut through the roar, commanding, steady, impossible to ignore. Clara could hardly hear herself think, but she clung to his words, to the sheer force of his presence. She ran where he pointed, waving her shawl, shouting until her throat burned. Mud clung to her skirts. Rain lashed her face, but she did not falter. And slowly, against the storm, against terror itself, the herd steadied. Jonah's will, iron and unyielding, bent even the wildness of fear. Clara's heart thundered with it. Not fear this time. Something else. Something fierce. By the time they stumbled back into the cabin, drenched and shaking, the storm had broken. Silence returned, save for their ragged breaths. Jonah looked at her then, truly looked. Mud smeared her face, hair plastered to her skin, eyes alight with fire she hadn't known she carried. "You shouldn't have come," he said, though his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. Clara met his gaze without flinching. "And yet I did." For the first time, Jonah smiled. Not faintly, not a flicker, a real, rare smile. It broke something in her. Or perhaps it mended. The storm had left the air clean and sharp, as if the land itself had been scrubbed raw. Dawn spilled over the plains in muted pinks and oranges, catching on the wet grass, turning every blade into a shard of light. Clara sat on the porch, a steaming mug in her hands, watching the horizon. Her muscles ached from a night's battle with the storm, but there was a pride in that ache. Every bruise, every scrape, felt like proof. She had faced down the rage of the West and had not broken. Behind her, the cabin door creaked. Jonah stepped out, broad shoulders silhouetted against the dim interior. He carried himself the same as ever, steady, unhurried, as if storms and stampede were little more than inconveniences. But when his gaze settled on Clara, there was something new there. A quiet acknowledgement. Respect, perhaps. "Coffee," he muttered, reaching for the pot. Clara handed him her mug without thinking. Their fingers brushed, and for the briefest instant, her heart faltered. Jonah poured, then sat heavily on the porch beside her. The boards groaned under his weight. For a time, they simply drank in silence, listening to the soft chorus of the waking earth. Finally, Jonah spoke. "You did good last night." Clara's chest tightened. The words, simple as they were, meant more than any polished compliment from her past life. "Thank you," she whispered. Jonah didn't look at her. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, but his hand shifted, resting not far from hers on the railing. Close enough she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. The days that followed carried a different rhythm. Clara found herself more at ease in Jonah's world. She fed chickens, mended tack, and even learned to ride one of the gentler horses. Her skirts hiked indecently high as she clung to the reins. Jonah watched, offering little guidance beyond a gruff "sit straighter" or "use your heels." But there was no mockery in his tone, only patience. At night, they shared the quiet of the cabin. Jonah spoke more now, not much, but enough. Stories of his father, who had built the ranch from nothing. Of winters so cold, even the cattle froze where they stood. Of neighbors long since gone, swallowed by the land's merciless hunger. Clara listened, spellbound. Each story was a thread, weaving her deeper into the fabric of his life. Yet not all shadows had been chased away by the storm. One evening, as Clara gathered water from the well, a rider appeared on the ridge. The man sat tall in his saddle, his coat black against the fading sky, his hat brim pulled low. Something in his posture set Clara's heart racing. Jonah emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. His entire body stiffened when he saw the rider. "Inside," he told Clara. His voice left no room for argument. Clara obeyed, though she lingered by the window, peering out as Jonah strode toward the stranger. The man dismounted, his movements deliberate, almost theatrical. They spoke, too softly for Clara to hear, but she saw the tension in Jonah's shoulders, the way his hand hovered near his belt, the way the stranger smiled, slow and cold. After a few minutes, the man swung back into his saddle and rode off, leaving dust in his wake. Jonah returned to the cabin, his face unreadable. Clara met him at the door. "Who was that?" Jonah hesitated, then shook his head. "No one you need to worry about." But Clara heard the lie in his voice. And for the first time, fear took root not from the land itself, but from the secrets Jonah carried. That night, sleep refused her. Jonah lay beside her, silent as always, but she could feel the storm inside him. Every turn of his body, every breath that seemed too shallow. At last, Clara whispered, "Jonah, was he here to hurt us?" Jonah's hand stilled where it rested on the blanket. After a long silence, he answered, "Not yet." Clara's blood ran cold. The days that followed were filled with unease. Jonah threw himself into work with renewed ferocity, riding farther, returning later, his jaw set hard. Clara did not press him, but the questions burned. Who was the man in black? What history did he share with Jonah? And why did Jonah, who feared nothing, not storm nor stampede, seem troubled by him? She wanted to demand answers, but she had learned enough about Jonah Blackthorn to know his truths were not given lightly. So she waited and watched and prayed that whatever shadow had returned to Jonah's life would not devour the fragile bond they were building. One evening, as the sun bled red across the sky, Clara found Jonah by the corral, leaning against the fence. His hat was tipped low, his gaze fixed on the horizon. She approached quietly, her skirts whispering against the dust. "Jonah," she said softly, "I know you want to protect me, but secrets don't keep anyone safe. Not really. They only make the danger grow." For a long while, he said nothing. Then he turned, meeting her gaze. "You think you're ready to know the kind of man I've been?" Clara swallowed hard. "I think I need to." Jonah's eyes darkened, and for the first time, she saw not just the rancher, not just the giant carved from earth and stone, but the weight of a past he carried like chains. The night was heavy with silence. Crickets sang in the grass, coyotes yipped in the distance, yet inside the cabin the air was still. Jonah sat at the small table, lantern light casting sharp planes across his face. Clara sat across from him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. For the first time since her arrival, she felt not like his wife, not like his companion, but like a stranger awaiting judgment. Jonah's voice was low, gravel dragged across stone. "You asked what kind of man I've been." Clara nodded, her throat too dry for words. Jonah stared into the flame, as though the story lived there and not in his chest. "There was a time I wasn't much better than the men you read about in dime novels. Guns for hire. We're paid in gold or whiskey. I didn't ask who bled when the job was done." Clara's fingers tightened in her lap. She had guessed at shadows in his past, but to hear it laid bare. Jonah went on. "The man you saw, his name's Silas Creed. Once he rode with me. We fought, we stole, we killed. He liked the taste of blood more than most. Eventually, I got sick of it. Wanted out. Wanted land, quiet, a life that didn't stink of gunpowder." His jaw clenched. Silas didn't take kindly to me leaving. Said no man walks away from blood brothers. Said one day he'd come knocking. Clara whispered, "And now he has." Jonah's eyes lifted to hers. There was no fear there, only inevitability. He'll keep coming back. Men like Creed don't forget. He'll circle, wait for weakness. That's what he does. Clara's heart hammered. For weeks, she had fought the land, the storms, her own doubts. But this was a different kind of threat, one she could not outlast with grit alone. "Still," she said, "you're not the same man anymore. You're not him." Jonah studied her, as though searching for a lie. Finally, he nodded. "Maybe, but Creed don't care about the man I am, only the man I was." The days that followed were taut as a drawn bowstring. Jonah trained harder than ever, riding out each morning with rifle strapped across his back. He checked the perimeter, repaired fences, set traps near the gullies. Clara watched him with a mix of awe and dread. This was Jonah Blackthorn stripped to his rawest core, rancher and warrior, protector and outlaw. The giant she had married was a man balanced between two worlds, and she was caught between the fear of losing him and the fear of becoming his burden. One afternoon, Clara found herself alone by the stream, scrubbing linens. The sound of hooves cracked the quiet. Her heart lurched, but it was not Jonah who rode into view. Silas Creed. He was leaner than Jonah, but there was a wolfish grace in his movements. His smile, sharp as a knife, spread slow across his face when he saw her. "Well now," he drawled, dismounting with deliberate ease. So the giant finally went and found himself a wife. Clara's grip tightened on the wet fabric. She forced her chin high. "You should leave." Creed's eyes glittered. "Feisty. I like that. Tell me, did Jonah mention how many men we put in the ground back in the day? Or did he keep those little bedtime stories to himself?" Clara's stomach churned, but she held his gaze. "You don't scare me." Creed chuckled, stepping closer. "Oh, you should be scared, darling. 'Cause men like Jonah, men like me, we don't get happy endings. And any woman fool enough to stand beside us, she's just kindling waiting to burn." Before Clara could reply, the thunder of hooves split the air. Jonah rode into the clearing, rifle raised. His voice was thunder itself. "Step away from her, Creed." Silas grinned wider, tipping his hat. "Relax, old friend. Just getting acquainted." But he obeyed, stepping back toward his horse. As he swung into the saddle, his eyes lingered on Clara. "We'll talk again, Mrs. Blackthorn. Next time, maybe without your mountain shadow hovering close." With that, he spurred his horse and vanished into the trees. Jonah dismounted in one fluid motion, striding to Clara. "You all right?" His hands gripped her shoulders, too rough in his urgency. Clara nodded, though her knees trembled. "He wanted to rattle me." Jonah cursed under his breath, dragging a hand through his hair. "I should never have left you alone." "Damn it." Clara touched his arm. "This isn't your fault. He wants you shaken. He wants me afraid. We can't give him that." Jonah stared at her, something fierce and unspoken burning in his eyes. Then, in a voice rough as gravel, he said, "You're stronger than I thought." Clara swallowed, her pulse hammering. "Maybe I have to be." That night, as the fire crackled low, Jonah sat close beside her on the bed. The distance between them, once filled with silence and restraint, was narrowing. "Clara," he murmured, "if Creed comes again, and he will, you need to know what kind of man I'll have to be. I won't hold back. I can't." Clara's hand found his, trembling yet steady. "Then I'll stand with you, whatever comes." For a long moment, Jonah said nothing. Then, slowly, he pulled her into his arms. The world outside was danger and shadow, but in that embrace, Clara felt something fierce and unbreakable take root. Not just survival, not just partnership, but love, raw, perilous, undeniable. The storm rolled over the plains, black clouds splitting with veins of lightning. It was the kind of night when the land itself seemed to hold its breath. Jonah Blackthorn stood in the barn, oiling the barrel of his rifle. Every muscle in his body coiled tight, every breath measured. He knew this storm was not the only one breaking tonight. Clara entered quietly, shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "You feel it too," she whispered. Jonah's eyes lifted. "Creed's close. I can damn near taste it." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then Clara stepped forward, laying a hand on his arm. "Promise me one thing, Jonah. No matter what happens, come back to me." Jonah's jaw tightened. He leaned down, pressing his forehead gently to hers. "I'll fight hell itself if it means I can keep that promise." The attack came just after midnight. Hooves thundered across the fields, shouts tore through the rain. Creed and his riders, 5 men, wild-eyed and armed to the teeth, descended on the ranch. Jonah burst from the barn, rifle blazing. His shots cracked through the storm, each one finding its mark with ruthless precision. The giant rancher moved like a force of nature, rain dripping from his broad shoulders, eyes alight with fire. Creed's laughter rang above the chaos. "There's the man I remember. The butcher, the storm." Jonah roared back, his voice a weapon. "That man's dead, Creed." The fight surged through the yard. Clara, instead of cowering, grabbed Jonah's spare revolver. Her hand shook, but her aim was steady as she fired at the man charging Jonah from behind. The attacker dropped, and for the first time Jonah looked at her not with worry, but pride. At last, it was only Creed and Jonah. They faced one another in the mud and rain, lightning throwing jagged shadows across their faces. Creed sneered. "You can't outrun blood, Jonah. You and me were carved from the same stone." Jonah's voice was iron. "No, I chose different. I chose her." With a roar, Creed lunged. The two giants collided, fists and fury in the storm. Each blow carried years of rage, betrayal, and brotherhood gone rotten. Clara screamed Jonah's name, but he fought on, unstoppable. Finally, with a last brutal strike, Jonah sent Creed crashing into the mud. The outlaw lay still, rain washing the blood from his face. Silence. Then only the storm remained. Jonah staggered back, chest heaving, body battered. Clara rushed to him, throwing her arms around his waist. He buried his face in her hair, holding her as though she were the only solid thing in the world. "It's over," she whispered. "For now," Jonah answered. "But as long as we've got each other, Clara, there ain't a storm we can't face." She pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. "And as long as we stand together, you'll never be too big for me to hold." Jonah's laugh rumbled low, even through the pain. And in that storm-broken night, their love was sealed, not just forged by fire, but proven in it. Epilogue. The weeks that followed brought sunlight after storm. The ranch grew stronger, the fences repaired, the fields tilled. Neighbors whispered about the night Creed came and fell, but Jonah and Clara spoke of it little. For them, the future lay ahead, not behind. In the hush of dawns and the warmth of dusks, they built their life together. And though the wind still carried echoes of danger, Clara no longer feared. Because the giant rancher who once frightened her was no monster. He was her shield, her partner, her love. And she, in turn, was his anchor, the one thing that made him choose light over shadow. And that's where our story ends tonight. But what about you? If you were Clara, would you have stayed by Jonah's side when Creed came calling, or would you have run? Tell us in the comments below. And if you want more tales of courage, love, and survival in the untamed West, don't forget to like this video, hit that subscribe button, and ring the bell so you never miss another story from Wanted Stories. Because out here, every storm leaves a story worth telling.